Great. Thanks, Grace. So as people continue to join, we want to welcome you all to the first ever joint rural and economic development working group meeting. This isn't the first convening of either working groups, but is the first time that these two groups are being brought together to discuss the timely um, topic of economic development within rural areas, particularly workforce development and implications for engaging rural and remote communities. So super glad to be welcoming you all. As you may have noticed, this meeting is being recorded, so we welcome anyone to be on camera and contribute during the discussion portion of the meeting. But if you're not comfortable being on camera, please feel free to stay off camera. And then we also ask that because this is a Zoom meeting please stay on mute if others are speaking, and feel free to use the hand raise feature towards the discussion portion to indicate that you're interested in speaking. With that, we'll move to the next slide. And just run through the agenda for today. This meeting is running from 2 p.m. Eastern Time to 3:15, and we have a pretty packed agenda as well as some very exciting state panelists that will present their perspectives. So we'll be kicking things off with a few welcomes and introductions, seeing as not everybody on this call is familiar with both the Rural Energy Working Group at NASEO and the Clean Energy-Based Economic Development Working Group. We'll also be providing a roundup of relevant resources from the NASEO and things that we've been hearing with approaching deadlines and things that may be of interest to you. And then we'll be getting to the meat of the conversation in our state panel discussion, which will be moderated by Tom Elliott, who is one of the co-chairs of our Rural Energy Working Group and an energy analyst at the Oregon Department of Energy. Joining Tom will be Kirsty McPherson from the Community and Economic Development Manager at the Colorado Office of Just Transition, Braden Connor, the Director of Investments at the Wyoming Energy Authority, and Sarah Murky, the Community Navigator at the Oregon Department of Energy. And then we'll be moving on to a full group discussion as well as an audience-led Q&A in case any of the conversations sparked additional questions, as well as next steps and a closeout from the NASEO team. So as promised, to level set, for anyone unfamiliar with the NASEO Rural Energy Working Group, we're very grateful to the Department of Energy, state and community energy programs for their support of our working group. The objectives are to empower state energy offices to engage rural and remote areas, which often experience disproportionately high energy burden and energy reliability challenges. And we accomplish this through quarterly convenings that facilitate dialogue between state, industry, and federal partners. We aim to share timely information on state and federal programs and funding opportunities to ensure that disadvantaged or rural and remote communities are receiving adequate resources and funding to stand up clean energy and further develop energy within their areas. And then we also hope to identify and develop resources based on guidance from our state co-chairs and to the broader body of NASEO State Energy Office membership, so that we can provide technical assistance on any number of issues or emerging priorities on energy development. And then with that, I'll pass things over to Grace to provide an overview of the Economic Development Working Group.
Great. Thanks, Jasmine. And thanks everyone so much for joining this call. I know many of you have been along for the ride as part of the State Clean Energy Based Economic Development Working Group, which meets at this time every month. But really glad to have additional members from the NASEO Rural Working Group joining this conversation today. And if you are normally in the Rural Working Group and haven't joined our Economic Development Group in the past, it launched last December and brings together state energy offices, as well as state and regional economic development organizations. And the goal is really to have an opportunity for best practice sharing, strategizing on common priorities such as workforce, siting and permitting, helping businesses with their power needs, and accessing federal funding and planning energy and economic development. We bring in experts for different topics, and we also help states in trying to maximize the potential of federal funding for clean energy. So in addition to these monthly working group calls, we've also had some in-person roundtables, one in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with the New Mexico Department of Economic Development and the State Energy Office, and then another one in Denver, where we brought together a number of state energy offices and state and regional economic developers. And this group is jointly facilitated by NASEO, as well as our partners at the International Economic Development Council and the Restart Institute. So I'll just maybe turn it over to Delaney with IEDC to just share a little bit about IEDC and the work they do with their members.
Sure, thanks, Grace. Yeah, we've been really excited to be part of this collaborative. The International Economic Development Council is a association organization for economic developers. We do courses, certifications, conferences throughout the year. And in addition to that, and the side of the organization that I tend to do more work on is our research and technical assistance and emerging practices teams. So we do a lot of work around helping communities, access technical assistance around disaster recovery, climate resiliency, equity. So we've been helping to kind of connect this work to what economic development organizations and practitioners are experiencing on the ground. And, in tandem with the state energy offices, thinking through strategies around how to deploy the incentives and resources that have become available, especially around, IRA and BIL and all of the other acronyms of funding and resources that have become available. So been great to work with Grace, and I'm really excited to hear from the Rural Energy Working Group and to kind of see where the synergies between what we've been talking about come together.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Delaney. And for anyone who is not in one or the other working groups and is interested in joining, feel free to reach out to any of us, and I'll have all the NASEO contacts on a slide at the end. And as Jasmine mentioned, we wanted to provide a little bit of framing and just share some of the relevant resources in this space that we think could be helpful to this specific group. So I know some of you may be familiar with the Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities and Economic Revitalization, or IWG for short. They have a lot of technical assistance, and they also have rapid response teams for certain energy communities, a federal funding hub that sort of brings together all the different competitive and formula opportunities for energy communities. And they have an upcoming workshop that might be of interest to a lot of you on the call on capacity building for energy assets on November 14th. Another group working in this area is BREC, the Building Resilient Economies and Coal Communities Network. That's funded by the U.S. Economic Development Authority and facilitated by the National Association of Counties. Rural Partners Network is also a great group. It's a whole of government approach, a lot of federal partners working together to support rural communities on a number of different topics and helping them access funding for different opportunities, including energy and clean energy. The Just Transition Fund is another group working in this space. They are a nonprofit and foundation funded, but have a lot of TA and resources. And they've also profiled a number of economic development organizations kind of working at this intersection and have supported that work as well. And then also wanted to share a resource or an initiative started by the Department of Treasury. They are trying to compile stories of different organizations and individuals who have taken advantage of the clean energy tax incentives available through the Inflation Reduction Act. And the goal is really to share out, what others are doing with the tax incentives and how it's making an impact in their community or for their household. So if you know of organizations or if you have gone after clean energy tax incentives, that's a great place to share the impact of those incentives and to learn from others and hear what they're working on. And also welcome anyone to add additional resources or groups that you're aware of that might be relevant to this group in the chat. And then just a few federal funding opportunities. I know there's a lot out there, but we tried to distill a few that may be most relevant to this group and that have upcoming deadlines. So the Rural Energy for America program provides loan financing and grant funding to agricultural producers and rural small businesses for clean energy and energy efficiency. Then there's also the energy improvements in rural or remote areas, support for rural and remote communities to build clean energy projects. Concept papers for that one are due February 27th. And I believe state and local governments are both eligible for that one. The training for residential energy contractors, competitive application. I know a lot of state energy offices are aware of that one. Applications are due January 15th of 2025. And again, that's $40 million for state and territory energy offices to train, test, and certify residential energy efficiency contractors. And there's also a Good Jobs in Clean Energy prize competition available. They're looking for coalitions, and they have like 5 different sort of types of entities that need to be a part of the coalition. But it's essentially an opportunity to form a coalition in phase 1 of the competition, and then there's sort of an action planning phase and then an implementation phase. And then last one I wanted to mention is the transmission, siting, and economic development funding opportunity. I think many of you may be aware of that one. It was available last year, and I think they recently announced selections, but there will be another round of funding, and I think DOE is expecting to announce that in early 2025. But there are 2 parts to that. So there's grant funding for siting and permitting of transmission lines, and then there's also grants for economic development projects along transmission corridors. So hopefully of interest to many of you in this group. And I'll just pause there in case there are any other opportunities or resources that you all can think of or that you want to add to this list. All right. Well, I think at this point, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I will pass it over to Tom Elliott, who is with the Oregon Department of Energy and is going to be moderating our state panel for today.
Thank you, Grace. Good morning and afternoon to everybody. Boy, that's a lot going on. I don't feel so guilty now to not remember everything, which is also sort of a good reminder for everyone, to kind of listen and learn and then to share, make new connections. So I think with that, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on my background. My background is kind of more at the micro and smaller scale of things. My first job at Oregon Department of Energy about 15 or 20, was it 20 years ago? Was working with finance, helping to finance small renewable energy projects. And then for the last 3 years, I've been working on energy efficiency as a front end to the rural, I can't even remember the acronym. See how bad I am? The REAP grants. We provide energy efficiency assessments and energy audits for that program. And so even if, on a macro scale, when you're transitioning out of coal or oil, those are really big challenges at a state level, but there's also local levels and even at kind of a macro or micro scale, helping businesses or residences with lowering their energy bills and have that's also a huge benefit. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time we're going to listen to the states and then hopefully have a really good discussion with that. I'm going to just ask for Kirsty to share a little bit what's going on in Colorado, and she's joining us from Craig.
Yeah, thank you. Well, hello everyone. My name is Kirsten McPherson. I'm the Community and Economic Development Manager for the Colorado Office of Just Transition, OJT. And I do live in Craig, Colorado. So I am in the northwestern corner of the state, and we are kind of what is being kind of told as ground zero for the coal transition. I work across the entire state, but obviously in my own community, we have three coal plant mines and then two coal-fired power plants. A very large amount of the tax base in this area, about 46%, comes from the coal and energy industry. So that's almost half of the operating budgets for every special district and the county and the city and a variety of other things. So it's a really big deal and a really big transition. Previously, before this job, I actually was doing this work all over the country. And my background is so I started in economic development about 10 years ago. And then my master's is in behavioral economics, where I focused on macroeconomic development around energy and industry transition. So I've worked in everywhere from coal to timber, steel, and kind of you name it. And then I was joking around with all of these, the rest of the panelists before. I'm also an entrepreneur. So in my own community, I employ 26 people. I have 12 businesses. I'm building a distillery, which is part of our transition strategy within our community. So I'm kind of firmly planted in both the public and private sector, which makes me a little bit unique. And as you will probably be able to tell pretty shortly, it also makes me a little bit more bold in some of the things that I say, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. You can ask my boss about that later. So a couple things about the Colorado Office of Just Transition. We are a legislatively formed office in 2019, and so the office officially kind of started at the beginning of 2020, rough timing. And so it's been almost 5 years that we've been operating. We're a team of 6 individuals. We are focused on both the community and economic development side as well as the worker transition side. And so about 15 million has went to workers and 15 million has went to communities. I obviously run the community side when it comes to working with communities on their transition strategies. We have multiple tiers within our state. So we have tier 1 communities and tier 2. So if you are directly related in the coal transition and you have a power plant specifically that is closing, you are tier 1. And if you had coal plants that were operating up until 2014, coal mines operating up until 2014 or now, you're a tier 2 community as well. So with that, some of the things that have kind of been blindly obvious. And some of the things that I noticed even before taking this job is what we don't necessarily pay attention to is one industry towns were created to be one industry. So that's everything from their infrastructure, that is all of their supporting businesses, that is the culture in the community, that is how education functions, that's how they kind of deem themselves in any type of like social or socioeconomic principle. And so when you're taking and coming into a community and saying you are no longer going to be this, there is a massive identity crisis that happens. So one of the very large things I'm focusing on is also the cultural implications of this transition and how do you set a community up for success and what happens next? Because as everyone I'm sure can probably relate, when you say that something is closing, the very next question is, well, what do we do next? And the state's perspective is that we are definitely supposed to be more of a support when it comes to those and not actually leading the transition. We're supposed to come across and come next to the communities and what their needs are. And so what we have started doing is, especially within our community grants, we have noticed 4 key things that each community is kind of really working on. And I should also note each community is vastly different when it comes to their individual transition, all the way from what is going to be given to each community from the departure of the industry, if they are for a nonprofit or a for-profit entity, where they kind of are they already closing or not? So this kind of makes the job a little bit more difficult. But some of the things that we've noticed is capacity. Communities don't have the capacity, especially to apply for grants. But managing grants is also a huge issue, which I'm sure everyone here, if you had your cameras on, everyone would be nodding because managing grants are really, really hard. And then we have the capacity component. We have the infrastructure conversations, which kind of took a lot of us off guard, especially the conversation from underground up. You can't attract new industry in if you don't have reliable infrastructure to be able to support that. And that's kind of come across, especially in our rural communities where you don't have enough of the water systems, you don't have your sewer systems, you don't have proper drainage. So that's been a really interesting kind of thing that we've been navigating through. The other thing that we've noticed a lot of is an uptick in outdoor recreation opportunities and grants associated with those. So how do you bring people into your area? And then third, lastly, fourth is business parks. And everyone, I think, always kind of is like, oh, well, we need a business park and we build it and they will come. As it turns out, economic development is not actually the field of dreams. You have to have an actual target strategy for what you're building. So we have been working with communities on that quite a lot on what makes sense, what kind of things can you create, what can you bring in? Because when I think the transition conversations initially started, everyone was like, oh, well, we'll turn the coal miners into coders and we'll attract Google. I don't know if, like, my dad was a coal miner for 45 years and he doesn't even own a cell phone. So, like, we can have that conversation at a different time. But what makes sense to transition into a community and what does the culture, education, and kind of the upskilling needs associate within that? And then some of the other major projects that we've also started working on is really focused around business retention and expansion. We have the obvious closures of a variety of different things happening, but we also have all these businesses that are supporting this industry as well. Everything from the restaurants who provide meals for like overtime and outages, hotels, tire shops, automotive industries, things like that. So how can we kind of maneuver around and make sure that those businesses are also going to be okay? And then some of the other things that we're working on is around rail and transportation, site selection and industry attraction, and then marketing and storytelling. So there's a variety of things that our office does, but our primary goal is to be able to partner with the communities on what they actually want to do and kind of help being a sounding board for what that looks like. And then looking at the cultural versus kind of social and that tax needs component. And then I'll kind of just like lastly end with the things that we've learned over the last several years. I think everyone's been very focused on the fact that when we talk about transition, we are talking about a completely new industry. And now we're kind of starting to realize that you can still transition from one energy economy into another because that makes sense for just the cultural and the workforce base of the areas. So just because you're not going to be coal anymore or coal-fired power plant, that doesn't mean that you can't be geothermal, solar, wind, hydro, all sorts of different components like that. And then also kind of another big kind of component that we're looking at too is that there are a lot of these miners that are planning on transitioning into entrepreneurship and what does that look like for the community and how do you kind of balance all of these different pieces out. So that's kind of a lot, a big heavy load that I'll just put on for OJT for you to take, Tom, and then we can, whatever questions and stuff come up after that, we'll go from there. And then I'll add into the chat for everyone just links to OJT as well as some of our other programs so you all can have that as well.
Wow. Kirsty, that's a lot to take in, and that's super interesting. And go
I'm
ahead, you
also a
start.
really fast talker, so I apologize for that.
Don't,
I get
don't,
very
don't.
excited.
No, that's great. I think the high energy level is great. And also just the ideas, the creativity, different things, and no, community is going to be the same. Also, just one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting was just, the idea that this coal is a community and it's both the mining and the power production, then suddenly we think because we're smart off somewhere that we're going to transition, we're going to turn them into coders. And just that example among many, I think was really interesting. So a lot of creativity and some stick-to-itiveness, I think, probably very helpful. Let's move on to Wyoming. Braden, are you ready?
Well, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity and thanks Nazio for hosting this again. Um, So my name is Braden Konar. I'm the Director of Investments at the Wyoming Energy Authority. We are the state entity that merges all things in energy and kind of acts as liaisons between the state legislature, between state government and our energy industry. Just kind of some background on the state of Wyoming. So Wyoming in 2018 was made up 40% of coal reserves in the United States. At one time, we produced about 40% of this nation's power, whether it's coal or oil or gas. We are an energy state. We export approximately between 12 and 15 times more energy than we consume. And so energy is in our blood. Um, I can appreciate what Kirsty said from coming from Northern Colorado and Craig and the coal patch in that area of Colorado. And like I can understand exactly what she's coming from because that is our entire state. We are, we're the least populated state in the nation, so we it's not a one community. We're going to have a few communities that are going to feel a significant impact, but our entire state's going to feel a large transition if that were to occur. Um, we, our entire state is based on energy, so our tax structure is about 65 to 70% severance tax. And so we don't pay a state income tax. We don't pay a corporate income tax. The majority of our state's revenues comes from energy. And so I think when we look at that, Wyoming is in a bit of a predicament of we have to think about this on a macro scale. We have to think about this for the good of the people, and what this looks like moving into the future. And so, the state of Wyoming has spent significant funding investing in like clean coal, clean carbon technologies. So we're capturing carbon at the site, um, and either injecting it back in the ground or utilizing it in enhanced oil recovery. Um, you know, we have significant wind. Solar hasn't really come on yet, but wind is significant. I think it makes up about 20% of our overall exports. So it's a large percentage of what we export power wise. But still, yeah, Wyoming is at truly ground zero from a state level of what does this transition look like? Um, we have 10,000 plus jobs in whether it's mining, power plants, or the supporting roles around around the industry. And so we're like it's significant. And so again, we're kind of I would say probably behind the eight ball when compared to other places. But again, we've taken a little bit different approach. We look at it as all above energy strategy. Our governor has hit on that, and so we endorse coal, oil, gas, renewables, geothermal, hydro, whatever. And so, um, I would say that we hear the conversations and the rhetoric that comes out of DC, and like we're the ones that have to figure that out. And it's it's something it's interesting to watch. I will say that. And again, I'll just wait for additional questions. But yeah, we're the energy state trying to figure this move out.
Excellent. Thank you, Braden. Well, I don't think Oregon can exactly claim huge exports, at least, at that scale. But interestingly enough, Approximately 40% of the electricity generated from hydroelectric in Oregon is used in the state, and 60% of what's generated comes from hydroelectric. And so, where can that be? Well, basically, I think the balance is exported. I think for the most part, it goes to Southern California. There's a direct current line. But anyway, we don't claim to have that. But as we transition and ask Sarah to share a few comments, we've gone through something a little bit like some of these things with in the Pacific Northwest, and I know that other communities in the West, as you know, logging and forest products has declined. What are the challenges that kind of support new economic bases and that kind of thing? Sarah's going to show a little bit, or share a little bit of what's going on in Oregon. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks, Tom. Um, as Tom said, my name is Sarah Murky, and I'm the Community Navigator for the Oregon Department of Energy, or ODO. The Community Navigator program is a relatively new program at ODO. I came on board in May of 2023, but before coming to ODO, I worked for the Ford Family Foundation and Rural Development Initiatives, which are both rural-focused economic development organizations in Oregon. I also am a certified as an Oregon economic developer through the Oregon Economic Development Association. So before coming and stepping into energy, I have a long history with economic development. ODO's Community Navigator program was developed to support environmental justice communities, particularly tribal, rural, and coastal communities, in accessing federal and state funding. And since May of 2023, I've traveled almost 18,000 miles to every county in Oregon, which some of those big states understand how crazy that is. And also have met with 8 out of 9 of the federally recognized tribes in Oregon, and I'm meeting with the 9th one on Thursday. So I'm very excited about that. I have been able to support communities in accessing over $18 million of state and federal funding for local energy projects and economic development projects in the first 18 months of the Community Navigator program. Oregon's rural areas face unique challenges, but they also offer really incredible opportunities to advance clean energy transition, clean energy initiatives that create jobs, lower energy costs, and enhance community resilience. ODO is committed to sustainable growth and community-led decision-making, particularly for our rural communities. Like Tom said, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Oregon's economic history, the economy in rural spaces primarily was a natural resources extraction economy, with some counties, such as the county that I live in, Douglas County, whose motto is the timber capital of the world, having about 35 to 40% of the workforce being employed by the timber industry in 1975. But as changes have come to the sector because of advances in technology or state and federal legislation, these numbers have significantly decreased. Douglas County is right now about 3.8%, so a significant decrease over the last 40 years. And this historical lens is really important context as ODO, as well as the state, continues working towards a just clean energy transition. We're really focusing on trying to make sure that this transition is not just another boom and bust economy in the making. As our rural communities are on the front lines of the effects of climate change through wildfire risk, snow, ice, and windstorms, and tsunami and earthquake damages, we continue to consider how we can ensure the benefits of a clean energy transition and economy are shared statewide, and that our rural communities are centered in the decision-making process. I'm happy to talk more like I know we're going to, but for now, I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I didn't realize that Roseburg in Douglas County was what was it again? I don't want to get it wrong.
Capital of the world is our official county motto.
Right. Well, one of the things that I was thinking about preparing for this, I went back and forth for like, well, I need to dig deep and learn a lot. No, just be flexible. And I was thinking just randomly, I was among the different thoughts that went through my mind, where's the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Does anybody know?
Cleveland.
Cleveland. So what does that have to do with this? Well, just kind of and here's another one. Has anybody not heard of wall drugs or wall drug? And yeah, so the point being is that, Cleveland, Ohio, obviously not a rural community, a city, and what formerly was known as Rust Belt. I don't know if we use that term anymore, but they got some entrepreneurial ideas and, brought in a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Wall Drug in South Dakota. I was driving through there years ago. I was like, what is this? And I think my mom or somebody had told me, when you're in this area, check it out. But all of this is back to sort of the idea of creativity. This is not going to solve the problem at the macro scale. But I think it does just go, to some of Kirsty and Braden's point, and Sarah as well. It's a huge, huge ask and opportunities. And just so I wanted to open it up, and any thoughts from any of the panelists to kind of, as you've heard the other three, and then invite others, to kind of join in from, the rest of the states. Okay, let's do some prompting. What about the idea of, jobs, certainly workforce training, even if we're not going to make your dad a Google coder who used to work in the coal mine, what sort of job training might there be? Any of the panelists or from anybody of the other one of states want to join in and share some on that?
One of the things that I think is really important, especially from like the government side, and this is where I can kind of sometimes get in trouble, so I'm kind of putting my private developer hat on a little bit here too, is that I think sometimes we get in the habit of thinking that the transition needs to be led by elected officials, local government, state government, things like that. I think sometimes we kind of forget that the transition and be able to replace taxes and jobs have to happen with the private industry. And so, what types of private industry makes sense to bring into those areas based off of culture, workforce assessments, housing, a variety of different things like that. And I think that we forget to have that conversation and bringing in the private developers and the private businesses to have those conversations. And I think that that's a really big area that we miss all the time. Even sometimes when it comes to energy, like transitions, like or trying to bring in a new energy company and things like that, they still have to understand the demographics and the scope of the community that they're coming into. And when it comes to what the workers want to do, I mean, like the obvious is always the obvious, right? Like if you're going to take a coal miner who is a mechanic out in the coal field, it makes sense that they're going to be a mechanic somewhere else, right? So I think that sometimes we also forget that the obvious is the obvious, and like where do we have these skills, and how are they going to translate into some sort of other industry? And I also think it's really important that we've been going through major industry transitions since the dawn of time.
Right.
And that kind of is a big piece as well. And like this is kind of like the next wave of the Industrial Revolution. Right now we're talking about energy. In the next 10 years, we're going to be talking about AI and all of the jobs that AI took. So this is not going to be an unusual thing. I think that we definitely need to lean more on private business than we have typically done in the past. And then having the like local governments and that type of stuff help provide more when it comes to incentives, when it comes to be able to like barriers to entry. Like if you want to redo a dilapidated building downtown, maybe don't charge $50,000 for a fire tap fee. Like, how do you like work around some of these different things like that? So I'm glad this is recorded. Everyone can record that and share that to your local governments.
That's excellent. Did Sarah or Braden, did you want to weigh in on that? Because we do have a question from someone else.
Yeah, I was just going to say, from the government side, Wyoming does a good job. We have community colleges kind of spread throughout the state, so then they have the ability to, uh, find those opportunities that are coming to their region and hopefully prepare help prepare that workforce. I think of like in Western Wyoming, we have TerraPower is really looking at a nuclear plant to be constructed in the next 10 to 15 years. And so even just based on that, the community college in that area has started looking at, okay, how do we train this workforce for these potential jobs? Now, there is a coal mine on that side of the state, and so some of those maybe can be repurposed or retrained with that's very labor that doesn't take a lot of resources, hopefully, and then anybody coming into that industry can hopefully work through those community college districts in those areas. Our big coal patch, Campbell County, Converse County has a community college that is very focused on those technologies of mining, power plant operation, um, right now, and then what does that look like transitioning into the future? So I think that those our community colleges can really be leveraged for job reentry, retraining, what have you.
That's a really good point, Braden. Thank you for sharing that. Sarah, did you want to jump in at all, or we have
Yeah.
a question from somebody too?
Oh, I would just reiterate what Braden was saying is one of the things that when we were going through this, it kept on popping up time and time again is community colleges and how important they are to our work. Not only because they, are in community and that's really helpful for getting that perspective, but they work with a wide group of people, not only government folks, but also private sector. And so they have a really great knowledge and they want to be at the table. And sometimes they are lumped together as like the community colleges at the state level, right? Versus like getting that individual attention. So it's been really helpful to meet with them one-on-one and learn about what's going on in their community and how they can be a good part of the transition for sure.
Oh, excellent. So it looks like there are a couple questions. I see one in the chat, but let's go to Hillary Scott, who's had a hand up for a bit.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. So if I can hear that most of you have a private sector, or at least Sarah and um, Christy have had some private sector experience. And so now that you're working with the government, if you were to be the designer of the system, right? Um, Christy, you've given a lot of good suggestions about incentives and barriers and remembering that the private sector can drive a lot of development. But I would imagine you came into a program that was already set up and you were encouraged to implement what they desired you to implement. But if you didn't have to implement something that someone had already established, what would you do? And Sarah, when you talk about it, what would the navigator actually, what authority would they have? What resources? What would the budget actually look like in an effort to really create the type of impact? What metrics would you say need to be used in an effort to determine if we have achieved the outcomes we expect to achieve? What would the end vision look like for these communities? What should it look like, and what should the metrics be to determine if we had an adequate impact?
I think there's a few things there, Christy. Sorry to jump. I would say one is, one of the things that my boss, Ruchi Sadir, our associate director of strategic engagement, says to me all the time, because I get really frustrated at how slow government works. She says to me, we've been entrusted to do this work. In the word entrusted that you see all over in government, there is a level of trust that we have to have in order to do our work. And in order to build that trust, what it takes is time in order to assess the situation and come to a reasonable outcome. And that's what I consistently think when, I hear and see people saying that government moves too slow or is whatever, is like, we've been entrusted, and to do this work and to do that, we have to build trust, and that takes time. If I could blink my eyes 3 times and change things, what I would do is I would I would build some sort of like rural office that works with all the different offices of the state to better coordinate. I think the state of Oregon is doing a really great job. I think we do a really bad job of telling our stories, and I think we do a really bad job of coordinating within ourselves to know how we can layer on top of things. We have a really, really awesome department. Our economic development department is called Business Oregon, and they give out millions and millions of dollars of incentives to not only businesses but local governments every year to build the capacity, but also infrastructure projects. And I think there's a lot of ways that like DEQ and all these different, us and all these different things could layer on top of those projects to make the impact so much bigger. But you have one city manager at a small city in Eastern Oregon that's trying to figure out the layering. And I think there's a way that we can do that better at the state. In terms of metrics, I think it's less about like collecting those metrics, because again, I think they exist. I think it's just the storytelling and the ability to use them well and share them in a way that's like accessible and that not only people at our agency understands and knows where they exist, but in other agencies and then throughout the state.
Thanks, Sarah. Kirsty, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, Sarah just rocked that one right out of the park. I mean, I don't have much to add based off of that. I will say, I, it's funny because I came in and I got to build all of my programmings with OJT. And what I have noticed is the hardest thing for me to work around is like we are designed inherently as our office at the state to be more flexible than most offices, but we still have to sit within the state system. And it still is taxpayer money. It still is government money. And I think that the big thing that like some of the communities, they're like, well, just write us a check and we'll deal with it. No. Like, that's the whole point is to be able to thoughtfully kind of think about like what is going to end up making sense, especially when you're dealing with short-term dollars for really long-term like problems. And I think sometimes, especially with capacity in rural areas, we are dealing with things of like if you were to hand a community of my size a $5 million check, I mean, probably guaranteed one of the very first projects that they're going to be doing is like sidewalks and things that they've been piling up for forever, right? Which is totally fair and absolutely reasonable. Unfortunately, with what we do and with what our money is really for short-term dollars for long-range planning and long-range projects. And I know everyone who works in economic development sitting on this call, like if you want to see like a real time, like, oh, I am doing this today and it's going to look like this tomorrow. No, it's going to look like that in a decade. If you want instant gratification in your job, you should probably be a house painter. Like that is just not like we don't get to do all of those different things here. And that's where I think people get really frustrated, especially in communities, because you don't actively see all the things that are going on, especially if you're dealing with underground up. So some of the big things that I wish that I had more of an opportunity to do from the get-go is more educating around what programs already exist, like really spending time with like some really big visionary types of conversations and brainstorming and that type of stuff, and being able to step into conversations a little bit differently than like having a funding partner be like, hey, we have money, like how can we help you? I think sometimes that's a good service and also a really big disservice. The other warning that I'm heeding to a lot of my communities right now, and I still do my consulting work across the country, the grant slush that has been happening over the last 5 years, that's about ready to be done. Like, I mean, I think we all know that that is kind of like it has a ticking time limit to it. The EDA, like they removed the the coal line, the coal impacted communities line, I think it got put back in the budget, but that was a really big signifier that some of these conversations and some of the things that we've had to like rely on aren't going to necessarily be there. So how do we kind of set these systems up for long-term success instead of being able to have to backfill? So it's Hillary, I don't really think I super answered your question there, other than the fact that it's like there's so many people involved in these conversations, and I'm sure all of you probably have already gathered that I am a very abrupt person. So I can tell you what not to do in meetings. Like, I can tell you that all day long. And so some of those different conversations. But if anybody actually wants to talk about any of that stuff, I'm happy to jump on one-on-one calls with anyone too.
Yeah, no, this is a really good conversation and very appropriate. And I mean, these are challenging topics, right? And so there's not necessarily easy answers, but I think that perspective of kind of expecting a sugar high in the rush of various sort of funding and throw it at it short term to solve long term sort of transitional. And it's like, whoa, oh yeah, that's kind of true, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't and can't, kind of play roles. And there's sort of expertise sort of thing. And then at some level too, there's dollars. Even in our little program, we find that we work with businesses, some of whom know exactly what I want. And it's almost like, okay, right already. I know that. I know that. Just how do I get the money to fund it? Versus some people, I don't even know where to start. I don't even, and then everything in between. And so often it is like, well, how do we sort of have a real one-on-one conversation with them to really make a good assessment? I mean, some people you can do this on AI and online, but really it's interactive in relationships. But anyway, I did want to kind of move to a question here from the chat. And this is to Kirsty from Margarita. And that's, what resources have you found useful for entrepreneurship? Like most people are used to being W-2 with salaried workers or, kind of getting a paycheck, not familiar what it requires to run a business. In addition, any financial assistance for wanting to start a business.
Yeah, man, you guys are throwing some of the heavy ones. All right, cool. Okay, so this is different for I think each state. I think each state does something probably moderately different. So I'll talk specifically to Colorado, and I'll try to highlight some things that I know you can do in other states too. Colorado is really focused on Western and rural entrepreneurship. So we have an organization called Startup Colorado, and we have an organization through that for rural startups. It is very much they don't really have necessarily grants or loans, but they do have startup competitions, and they have a venture hub. Each state should, in theory, have your own angel funds and your own angel, like they'll have kind of like a cohort. So investor angels, and then also your venture like angels, that type of stuff. So look in, and there's always like a guild in each state. So look into those activities because they're usually startup competitions and things like that. That's a really easy way to start like getting some initial funding. And also it's a really good way for people to start testing out if their business plan is worth a hoot. Like not every business plan is a good business plan. Like, and I know that that's always kind of a tough pill to swallow for people. I've had just as many failures as I've had successes. I mean, I just closed a business last week. So I think sometimes having that a little bit of a reality check and be able to kind of work through some of those things is really important. Our community colleges are very involved when it comes to business programs and some things like that. And most community colleges, I mean, have kind of classes in the evenings to be able to at least do basic accounting, have basic marketing kind of conversations and things like that. And usually through those, there are some different cohorts. What I have particularly noticed in my own area is that it's really hard to get entrepreneurs together to be able to talk. Especially in rural areas, for some reason, we always kind of seem like we're in competition with each other instead of being able to help each other. And so that's a conversation that I think has to happen internally whenever you're building an ecosystem. If you don't have an entrepreneur ecosystem within your community, you're not going to be able to have strong entrepreneurs. Like that's just kind of like if you don't have support structures, you're not going to have vibrant businesses started. Um, and I also think that some of the other like incentives and funding programs, communities themselves, looking at creating an urban renewal authority. If you don't have one of those, that's a really great tax incentive to be able to help businesses to be able to come in, and they have to put up money to be able to get money. So that's a really good opportunity if your community doesn't have one. Local marketing districts are a really great opportunity. And then again, like working with your local banks. Right now, we have like the green banks and a variety of different things. And you have the ability to have CDFIs. Like in your banks, will know all of the other different resources. They will typically go through an SBA loan. If you are getting an SBA loan, you have to work through your SBDC center. If you're in a community like mine, we didn't have an SBDC center for, well, I'm in my 30s, so about 31 years. So, like, I think that trying to, if you want entrepreneurship, you have to fight for that ecosystem, but you have to have businesses and entrepreneurs who are willing to kind of create that as well. It's kind of an equal marriage kind of part when it comes to that. And then, much like everything else, you have to figure out how to capital stack. Entrepreneurs have to do that just as much as local governments. The project sizes are obviously a lot smaller. Um, but through like my distillery that we're building right now, it's been a 3-year project. We're turning the still on in about 2 weeks. But we've done everything from urban renewal authorities, brownfield grants. We've gotten local marketing district money. We've done crowdfunding. We have done a variety of different things. And so, again, if entrepreneurship is something that you really want to focus on individually for your own area and you want to talk more about that, I'm happy to do so as well. One of the things that I will say that has been super helpful in our area, I created a couple different programs myself. We have one that's kind of like a quasi underground economic development group called Making Place. And it's just a bunch of like local developers, business owners, thought leaders, people who are just really involved and interested in making the community something new, sit around and talk about things that we're really important on. And what we do is we kind of back up the local governments, so city council, county commissioners, and say like, hey, 25 people just signed on, say that we want a rail district in town. Like you don't have to be as a single elected official sticking your neck out. You have all of the downtown businesses to be able to like help with that as well. And then we also have a thing called Welcome to the Neighborhood, which has really spurred a lot more of the economic development conversations, especially around entrepreneurship. And because that kind of is creating and showing the new people in town, because most of our, especially in rural communities, most people are coming with their own business or their own job. They're working remotely, they're things like that. So trying to connect them into the community is an easy way to be able to start building that ecosystem.
Can I add something
That's,
to that? I think that
yeah,
was a really great example, but kind of bringing it back to what we're thinking about at Odo around energy efficiency workforce and especially entrepreneurship. You know, one of the things that I've said 100 times is like no one becomes an electrician because they want to manage a business, or no one wants to, becomes an HVAC, person because they want to manage a business. They become it because they want to be an electrician. And so some of those partnerships that we are hoping to develop through some state workforce money that the legislator invested in Odo to distribute, as well as some of the federal money that's coming through the truck grants and some other things. We're really excited to work with our workforce partners. I have two colleagues on the call as well, Mary and Josie, and both of them are, Mary's our economist and Josie is our workforce person. And this is really new space for Odo to be in, is really like getting out into communities and seeing how we can develop a solid workforce that serves the community while also doing that. And We don't want to reinvent the wheel. I had a chamber director used to say, we just need to do some R&D, rip off and duplicate. And that's really what we're like looking at, is how we can look at what's happening and what's going on, especially in some of the more populated areas in Oregon, and then bring that out to rural areas. And the reason maybe why they didn't do that before is because of money reasons, and we've got money. So we're already seeing that partnership, Clackamas Community College, which is in the Portland area, and Treasure Valley Community College, which serves Eastern Oregon, and it's super far away, have started a really great partnership to bring some solar installation and looking at what clean tech means for their region as well. So I think there's the opportunity to bring partners to the table that might not typically work together in order to better serve our entrepreneurs through the energy ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Really good ideas, everybody. Braden, I'm wondering if you had any ideas in and around sort of community engagement. There were some prompting questions about some best practices and challenges. We've talked a little bit, this topic of infrastructure has come up some. Another one that I think is kind of interesting and might be relevant as well here is, who are some trusted messengers and messages in a rural context? And any of those resonate with you? Because I think, Wyoming, even though it's unique in some ways, there's, I think, some commonality of issues and kind of almost in the extreme that you're dealing with that might be instructive.
Yeah, so I think that when it comes to community engagement, changing a mindset, if you will, I think it comes down to what is that community's identity, and then how do they foresee their future? And so, we have the Wyoming Business Council, which is our state economic development entity. Kind of, I guess, bridging from the last question, they have worked hard in the last few years to really leverage assets across the state, in communities across the state, no matter where it is, and to add value to whatever that economy is, whether it's the coal economy, the Trona economy, the oil and gas economy, whatever. And so, yeah, I think that if they can, we can just continue those conversations, that thought processes of, you can add value to these economies. New isn't always bad. And then I think really it comes down to like your local leadership, whether it's business leaders, trusted local government officials. They're the ones that probably have to spend the time selling it. Like, you're not going to get some person from state government, so in Wyoming, coming from Cheyenne, going across the state to tell that community how they need to transition to a solar economy or to a wind. Like, no, that's not going to work here. So if we can, if you can kind of keep the heart there, and I went to school for agriculture, and so you got beat into your head, specialize and diversify. So if you can still specialize in coal mining or coal extraction or whatever, and diversify that economy into data centers or a solar play or what have you, I think that there's always opportunity there. It's just who's telling the story is kind of the one that you have to leverage the person that's going to sell it best.
Yeah, really good point. I'm from Cheyenne. I'm from Denver. I'm from Salem, and I'm here to help. Right. So those are really good points, everybody. I'm kind of wondering if there's anything else that just from the panelists that's bubbling up to you. We're getting kind of close to winding up for the next 5 minutes. I'm not sure how much time Jasmine and Grace wants, but in listening to each other, Are there any sort of points that you think maybe we haven't brought out yet, just in the whole area of economic development and rural communities, just transition?
I think one of the things that I would add to what Braden just said, and also just as something that I continue to think about, is when I travel and meet with folks, the reason why I believe that my program has had so much success is because I don't start with, here's our programs. I start with, what are you working on? What are your interests? What are your values? What are you looking forward to? And then you can layer energy on top of any of that. I think one of the things that we have seen in Oregon, at least, is that energy is economic development. Economic development isn't energy, but economic development needs energy in order to be its best economic development. And so you can talk to a small town and you can say, what are you working on? And they're like, oh my God, my sewer treatment plant is failing. I don't know what to do, blah, 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 right? And that is stopping economic development from from coming into that small town because they don't have a sewer treatment plant that can expand. And so you say, well, we have this great program that, isn't a sewer treatment plant, but you have a couple of acres of land right next to a sewer treatment plant. You could install solar. That solar would bring in, $100,000 a year. The grant would cover it 100%. You would have resilient backup, and you would have $100,000 in the bank from your that you aren't paying power bills on, to leverage into federal and state resources. And that kind of layering and that thought of how can energy fit into economic development? How can energy fit into anything else that the community is thinking about or struggling with or working through or values? That's been really impactful in getting money out the door and showing how our programs can show up, especially in rural communities.
Thank you for sharing that. Sarah even introduced our program to somebody out from La Grande, I think, a smaller community in Eastern Oregon that was trying to do some downtown redevelopment and repurposing some businesses that had been in the same families. And I believe some of them were warehouses and to be inhabitable and to be able to use for redevelopment. They're probably going to need some new HVAC that actually works and isn't going to cost, kind of an arm and a leg. And so that's a little bit more of kind of on a micro scale. They're like, well, how do we get to economic development? Well, we kind of need this energy efficiency piece in there. So that's a kind of a niche thing. Again, starting with the economic development and how energy might play a role. Braden or Kirsty, to you, any other sort of ideas that kind of thinking we haven't heard about or elaborated on anything that Sarah said?
I think for me, and really kind of like the biggest thing that I'm trying to get to at this point and trying to always make sure that I'm saying is the bigger, the crazier, the more like out there idea, especially around economic development, like now is the actual time to try and do it. Like we still have a little bit of time as these communities are kind of moving and shuffling kind of around with what their transition strategy looks like and things like that. And I think that we are inherently so afraid to try something new, especially in communities that have been doing, I mean, this is a generational type of thing, right? Like we have, I mean, my dad worked in the coal mine for 45 years. Like the coal industry raised me, and trying to tell my community from the last several decades that has had 2 or 3 generations working in it that we're going to do something else now is scary. So trying to be bold and big and really kind of think about a variety of different kind of things to make it like now is the time to do that. We don't have time to be afraid anymore. And if it doesn't work out, this is where like the government versus private sector don't always mesh very well, is because like usually you're told like if it doesn't work out, like it's the end of the world in government. In business, if it doesn't work out, like, oh well, we'll just try it a different way. So that's kind of where I want to encourage people the most, is just like really think beyond and see what happens.
Love
I
it.
love a good brainstorming session. So if anybody needs that, like just give me a call too.
Well, we're gonna and this obviously is gonna be on our own time, but we'll be waiting for that distillery product to wind up for some Christmas cheer or something in some future sort of times, not on work again. Braden, did you have any closing thoughts that you kind of wanted to share here? This really interesting discussion, everybody.
I would just say, I hope that like the communities wherever they are can like understand and really weigh their options when it comes to opportunities. In my previous role, I was the director of an economic development entity in a small rural county on the eastern side of Wyoming, and we had a solar farm that was still interested in constructing, and being having Wyoming having the identity of a coal and oil and gas state, like renewables is scary. Like no one wants to look at these people. Residents didn't want to look at a solar farm, and but we've never had an industry, or we've never had an energy economy at all here, and so we're very agricultural, which also kind of can cause issues there. But I would just say that, opportunities come and go, and I hope that those counties, those communities can really weigh the good and bad of those opportunities and decide, what's best, whether it's from a tax revenue standpoint or whether it's from a view shed standpoint, what have you. But, there's always opportunities out there, and I hope that people don't get caught up in the fossil versus renewable stigma and really look at, okay, is this moving us forward? Is this going to set up our schools better? Is this going to set up our local government better? Is this going to whatever? So I just think that there's, like I said, there's always opportunities, and I hope people can weigh the good and bad.
Yeah, Braden, really good thoughts. I love it. I think that's probably a really good place to sort of leave off some of the panelists' ideas and invite Grace or Jasmine to come back on and kind of wrap it up. Kind of be on time.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Tom, Sarah, Kirsty, and Braden. That was a fantastic discussion, and I think provoked a lot we could keep discussing in future meetings of both the Rural Energy Working Group and this Economic Development Working Group. I think you all just brought a unique lens from each of your states and kind of wove it together just perfectly. And I really appreciate all the questions and comments in the chat and from others in the audience, and look forward to future calls on this topic and related topics. And I'll go ahead and pull up our contact information so you all have it, but I'll also turn it over to Jasmine if she has any other final comments or announcements.
No, nothing much more to add. Appreciate all the good dialogue in the chat as well. I think Kirsty and uh, Tom and Sarah and Braden, you all brought really unique perspectives and obviously highlighted challenges within your state that we just simply didn't have the time this afternoon to dive into. So, in case you all are willing to continue these dialogues, feel free to kind of let Grace or myself know. And then any folks on the line who are interested in getting connected can also let us know. We can kind of facilitate these introductions. But yes, thank you, Grace, for pulling up the contact information. Kelsey, my colleague, and myself are the leads of our Rural Energy Working Group, and welcome anyone on this call from the IEDC and Economic Development Working Group side to tune into our meetings as well, and want to carve out more opportunities to have these discussions. So thank you all for your attention today.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon. And thanks again,
Thanks,
Tom,
everybody.
Kirsty, and Braden, and Sarah.
This was really great. I learned a lot. Thank you, Tom, for facilitating.
Very welcome. It was fun.